The fluorescent lights of Mel's diner buzzed their familiar tune as Jessica Martinez wiped down table 7 for what felt like the 100th time that evening. At 26, she had perfected the art of invisible service, moving through her shifts like a ghost in sensible shoes, collecting tips that barely covered her rent, and watching dreams slip away one double shift at a time. The dinner rush had finally died down, leaving only the usual suspects scattered across the cracked vinyl booths. Old Frank nursed his coffee at the counter. The couple in booth 3 whispered over shared pie, and a businessman in an expensive suit sat alone at table 12, staring at his untouched burger like it held the secrets of the universe. Jessica had learned long ago not to judge customers by their appearance, but this man was different. His suit probably cost more than she made in 3 months. His watch caught the diner's harsh light with every subtle movement, and his presence seemed to fill the entire space with an energy she couldn't quite name. He'd been sitting there for nearly an hour, occasionally glancing at his phone, but mostly just existing in that peculiar way wealthy people did when they found themselves in places that didn't match their tax bracket. The bell above the door chimed, and Jessica looked up to see another well-dressed figure entering. This woman moved with the kind of confidence that came from never having to check her bank balance before making a purchase. Her hair was styled in a perfect bob that probably required weekly maintenance, and her heels clicked against the linoleum with military precision. She scanned the diner with calculating eyes before her gaze settled on the man at table 12. Without hesitation, she walked directly to his table and slid into the booth opposite him. Jessica couldn't help but notice how the woman's presence seemed to drain some of the mysterious energy from the man. His shoulders sagged slightly, and he finally picked up his burger, taking a mechanical bite that suggested he was eating out of obligation rather than hunger. Their conversation was too quiet to overhear, but Jessica caught fragments as she refilled water glasses and cleared nearby tables. Words like deadline and expectations and family legacy drifted across the diner like smoke. The woman's voice carried an edge that could cut glass, while the man's responses were measured and careful, as if he were walking through a minefield with every syllable. Jessica had seen enough workplace drama in her years of service to recognize a power struggle when she witnessed one. This wasn't a romantic dinner or a casual business meeting. This was a confrontation dressed up in expensive clothing and conducted in hushed tones over lukewarm coffee and untouched food. The woman reached into her purse and pulled out a small leather folder, sliding it across the table with the practiced ease of someone who had done this before. The man opened it, his expression shifting from resignation to something Jessica couldn't quite identify. Surprise? Fear? Relief? It was impossible to tell from her vantage point behind the coffee machine. What happened next would replay in Jessica's mind for weeks to come. The man closed the folder and placed it on the table between them. Then he reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew something that made Jessica's breath catch in her throat. It was a set of keys, but not ordinary keys. These were ornate, old-fashioned things that looked like they belonged to a castle rather than a car. The metal gleamed gold in the diner's harsh lighting, and even from across the room, Jessica could see they were attached to a heavy fob that seemed to pulse with its own importance. The man placed the keys on the table next to the leather folder and pushed both items toward the woman. She stared at them for a long moment, her perfectly composed facade cracking just enough to reveal something vulnerable underneath. Then she shook her head and pushed the keys back toward him. This dance continued for several minutes, the keys sliding back and forth across the scarred formica surface, like pieces in some elaborate game Jessica didn't understand. With each exchange, the tension at the table ratcheted higher, until the very air around them seemed to vibrate with unspoken conflict. Finally, the woman stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor, with enough force to make old Frank look up from his coffee. She leaned down and whispered something to the man that made his face go pale. Then she turned on her heel and walked out of the diner, leaving behind only the faint scent of expensive perfume and the echo of her departing heels. The man sat alone at table 12, staring at the keys as if they might burst into flames at any moment. Jessica watched him wrestle with some internal debate, his hands clenching and unclenching on the tabletop. Minutes passed in this strange tableau, the man at the table frozen in indecision. Jessica at her station, pretending to organise napkin dispensers while keeping one eye on the unfolding drama. Old Frank at the counter, oblivious to everything except the bottom of his coffee cup. The couple in booth 3 lost in their own quiet world of shared dessert and whispered promises. Then the man made his decision. He stood up suddenly, throwing a $20 bill on the table next to his barely touched meal. But instead of taking the keys and folder with him, he left them sitting there on the formica surface like abandoned artifacts from another world. He walked to the door with quick, determined steps, and Jessica heard the bell chime his departure into the night. The keys remained on table 12, catching the light and casting tiny rainbows across the worn tabletop. Jessica approached slowly, as if the objects might bite her if she got too close. The leather folder was thick and expensive looking, the kind of thing that probably contained important documents or life-changing information. The keys were even more mysterious, their ornate design and substantial weight suggesting they opened something far more significant than a front door or safety deposit box. Jessica looked around the diner, hoping someone else would take charge of the situation. Old Frank was counting out exact change for his coffee, muttering about inflation and the good old days. The couple in booth 3 was deep in conversation about weekend plans and grocery lists. The night manager was in the back office, probably doing paperwork or catching up on inventory. There was no one to make this decision except her. She picked up the keys first, surprised by their weight and the warmth they retained from the man's nervous handling. The fob was engraved with an elaborate crest that looked like something from a history book, all scrollwork and symbols she couldn't decipher. The keys themselves were unlike anything she'd ever seen, more like medieval artifacts than modern security devices. The leather folder was equally intriguing. It was sealed with a small brass clasp that opened with a satisfying click. Inside, Jessica found documents that made her eyes widen in disbelief. Property deeds, bank statements, legal papers covered in official seals and signatures, and at the top of the pile, a handwritten note in elegant script that made her heart race. The note was simple, just a few lines that changed everything she thought she knew about the evening's events. It wasn't a business dispute or family argument she'd witnessed. It was something far more significant, a transfer of responsibility that would alter the course of someone's entire existence. Jessica closed the folder and looked around the diner again, the keys heavy in her other hand. The weight of what she'd discovered pressed down on her like a physical force. These weren't just abandoned objects left behind by careless customers. They were tools of transformation, instruments of change that someone had deliberately placed in her path. The fluorescent lights continued their eternal buzz. Old Frank finally left his exact change and shuffled toward the door, and the couple in booth 3 called for their check. The world continued its ordinary rotation while Jessica stood at table 12, holding objects that represented anything but ordinary circumstances. She thought about her life, about the endless cycle of double shifts and counting tips, and wondering if there was more to existence than surviving until the next paycheck. She thought about dreams deferred and opportunities missed and the slow erosion of hope that came with too many years of just getting by. The keys grew warmer in her palm as if responding to her thoughts. The leather folder seemed to pulse with possibility, and somewhere in the back of her mind a voice whispered that this moment was different from all the others, that this was the instant when everything could change if she had the courage to let it. Jessica's hands trembled as she stared at the objects that had suddenly transformed her ordinary evening into something extraordinary. The weight of the keys seemed to increase with each passing second, and the leather folder felt like it contained the secrets of the universe. She glanced toward the kitchen window where Miguel was scraping the grill clean, completely oblivious to the drama that was quietly unfolding in the room. The smart thing would be to turn everything over to the night manager. Let him deal with whatever complicated situation these wealthy strangers had left behind. But something deep inside Jessica rebelled against that practical voice. How many times had she been the invisible servant, cleaning up other people's messes without ever being part of the story herself? How many nights had she watched life happen around her while she remained safely on the sidelines, wiping tables and refilling coffee cups? She looked at the handwritten note again, her eyes scanning the elegant script that seemed to shimmer under the harsh diner lighting. The words were simple, but their implications were staggering. This wasn't just about money or property or business arrangements. This was about power, about legacy, about the kind of life-altering opportunity that people like her were never supposed to encounter. The bell above the door chimed again, making Jessica jump. A young man in a delivery uniform entered, carrying a stack of pizza boxes that smelled like salvation to anyone who'd been surviving on ramen noodles and hope. He approached the counter where Miguel emerged from the kitchen, and they conducted their transaction with the easy familiarity of a routine that played out every Friday night. But Jessica barely noticed the exchange. Her attention was consumed by the impossible choice before her. The rational part of her mind catalogued all the reasons why she should step away from this situation. She didn't know these people. She had no idea what kind of legal or financial complications might be involved. Getting mixed up in rich people's problems was a guaranteed way to get hurt. Yet the keys seemed to burn against her palm, and the folder felt heavier with each moment of hesitation. What if this was her moment? What if this was the universe finally offering her a chance to be more than just a background character in someone else's story? She thought about her apartment, with its leaky faucet and broken air conditioning unit that the landlord kept promising to fix. She thought about her bank account, which seemed to hover perpetually between empty and emptier. She thought about her mother's medical bills, stacked on her kitchen table like a monument to all the things she couldn't afford to fix. The delivery driver left with a cheerful wave, and the diner settled back into its late-night quiet. Old Frank had departed, leaving behind the ghost of his presence and the lingering aroma of too much coffee. The couple in booth 3 was settling their bill, counting out crumpled ones and fives with the careful precision of people who understood the value of every dollar. Jessica made her decision. She slipped the keys into her apron pocket, where they clinked softly against the collection of pens and order pads that made up her professional arsenal. The leather folder went under her arm, hidden beneath a dish towel that she hoped would disguise its importance from casual observers. The rest of her shift passed in a blur of mechanical motions and distracted thoughts. She poured coffee without really seeing the cups, cleared tables while her mind raced through possibilities and consequences. Miguel noticed her distraction but attributed it to the usual exhaustion that came with pulling double shifts. The night manager emerged from his office long enough to count the register and lock up the cash, never suspecting that his most reliable waitress was harbouring secrets that could change everything. When closing time finally arrived, Jessica helped stack chairs and wipe down surfaces with unusual efficiency. She wanted to escape before anyone noticed her nervous energy or asked uncomfortable questions about her eagerness to leave. The keys seemed to grow heavier in her pocket with each passing minute, and the folder under her arm felt like it was broadcasting its importance to anyone who cared to look. Miguel finished cleaning the grill and hung up his apron with a tired sigh. "Another glamorous evening in the food service industry," he said, attempting his usual end-of-shift humour. "See you tomorrow, Jess. Try to get some sleep." Jessica nodded and mumbled something appropriate about rest and recuperation, but her mind was already racing ahead to what came next. The address on the documents in the folder wasn't far from the diner, maybe a 20-minute drive through the winding roads that led up into the hills where the city's wealthy residents built their fortresses of privilege and privacy. She'd driven through those neighbourhoods before, usually on her way to somewhere else, marvelling at the manicured lawns and imposing gates that separated the haves from the have-nots. The houses up there weren't just homes, they were statements, declarations of success that could be seen from miles away. The parking lot behind the diner was empty except for her ancient Honda Civic, which looked even more pathetic than usual under the security lights. The car had been reliable, if not particularly inspiring, but now Jessica found herself wondering if it would make the journey up into the hills without breaking down and stranding her in unfamiliar territory. She sat in the driver's seat for several minutes, the keys from the diner heavy in her lap, while her car keys dangled from the ignition. The smart thing would be to go home, to sleep on this decision and approach it with a clear head in the morning. But Jessica had learned that smart things and right things weren't always the same, and something told her that waiting would only give her time to lose her nerve. The engine turned over on the third try, and she pulled out of the parking lot with the careful deliberation of someone who understood that every choice from this moment forward would matter. The late-night streets were mostly empty, populated only by delivery drivers and night shift workers making their way through the city's quiet hours. As she drove toward the hills, Jessica tried to imagine what she would find at the address written in the elegant script. A mansion, certainly, but what kind of mansion? What kind of life was she about to step into, even temporarily? And what kind of person would leave keys to such a place with a complete stranger in a rundown diner? The questions multiplied with each mile, but Jessica found that she wasn't afraid of them anymore. The road began to climb, winding through neighborhoods where the houses grew larger and the spaces between them expanded into something approaching privacy. Streetlights became fewer and farther between, replaced by the warm glow of landscape lighting that turned every property into a carefully orchestrated display of wealth and taste. Jessica's Honda labored up the steeper grades, but the engine kept running steady, as if the car itself understood the importance of this journey. The leather folder sat on the passenger seat beside her, its contents representing possibilities she'd never dared to imagine during all those long nights of serving coffee and counting tips. When Jessica finally reached the address, she had to pull over and read the numbers on the folder 3 times before accepting what she was seeing. The mansion that rose before her wasn't just a house, it was an architectural statement that seemed to defy both gravity and good sense. Wrought iron gates stood open as if expecting her arrival, revealing a driveway that curved through perfectly manicured grounds toward a structure that belonged in a magazine rather than reality. The Honda's engine ticked as it cooled in the sudden silence, and Jessica sat gripping the steering wheel with white knuckles, staring at what appeared to be her destination. The mansion was a masterpiece of old-world craftsmanship, all stone and timber and leaded glass windows that caught the moonlight and threw it back in fragments of silver fire. Turrets and gables created a skyline that belonged to fairy tales, while carefully positioned spotlights transformed the entire structure into something that seemed to glow from within. Jessica's hands shook as she pulled the ornate keys from her pocket, their weight now seeming almost insignificant compared to the magnitude of what lay before her. The logical part of her mind screamed warnings about trespassing and breaking and entering, but those concerns felt distant and theoretical when faced with the immediate reality of open gates and the address that matched the documents perfectly. She drove slowly up the circular driveway, her headlights sweeping across fountain sculptures and topiary gardens that probably cost more to maintain than she made in a year. The Honda looked absurdly out of place in this environment, like a paper airplane in a museum of fine art. But the gates had been open, and the address was correct, and the keys in her pocket seemed to pulse with their own certainty. The front door was massive, carved from what appeared to be a single piece of dark wood, and decorated with brass fixtures that gleamed like captured sunlight. Jessica approached it with the careful steps of someone walking across thin ice, half expecting alarms to sound or security guards to emerge from hidden positions. But the night remained quiet, except for the distant sound of water flowing over stone and the whisper of wind through carefully pruned trees. The first key she tried fit perfectly into the elaborate lock, turning with a solid click that echoed across the entryway like a gunshot. The door swung open on well-oiled hinges, revealing an interior that made Jessica's breath catch in her throat. The foyer soared 2 stories high, dominated by a chandelier that cast rainbow patterns across marble floors, polished to mirror brightness. A grand staircase curved upward toward a landing that disappeared into shadows, while doorways led off in multiple directions toward rooms she could only imagine. Jessica stepped inside, her footsteps echoing in the vast space despite her efforts to move quietly. The air smelled of lemon oil and fresh flowers, suggesting a staff that maintained this place in perfect condition even when the owners were absent. Everything she could see spoke of wealth so profound that it had transcended mere luxury and become something approaching art. The leather folder felt heavier in her hands as she moved deeper into the house, passing through rooms that seemed designed to showcase different aspects of refined living. A library with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves and a fireplace large enough to roast an entire pig. A formal dining room with a table that could seat 20, and china displays that probably represented someone's entire inheritance. A music room with a grand piano that gleamed like black marble, and paintings on the walls that looked like they belonged in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Each room revealed new wonders and deepened the mystery of why she was here. The documents in the folder had been specific about her access to the property, but they hadn't explained the purpose behind this elaborate gift. Was this some kind of test? A practical joke played by people with too much money and too little sense? Or was it something more significant? A genuine opportunity that she was too overwhelmed to fully comprehend? In what appeared to be the main living room, Jessica discovered the first clue to the evening's true purpose. A letter sat propped against a silver-framed photograph on the mantelpiece, her name written across the envelope in the same elegant script she'd seen in the diner. Her hands trembled as she opened it, extracting several pages of heavy paper that felt expensive between her fingers. The letter began with an apology for the unconventional nature of the evening's events, explaining that the writer had observed her for several weeks and had been impressed by her kindness toward difficult customers and her dedication to her work despite challenging circumstances. It went on to describe a situation that sounded like something from a novel rather than real life, involving family obligations and business pressures and the kind of complex inheritance disputes that only affected people wealthy enough to have something worth fighting over. But the letter's most shocking revelation came in its final paragraphs, where the writer explained that Jessica had been chosen not as a random recipient of charity, but as someone who had demonstrated the character necessary to handle a responsibility that went far beyond simple caretaking. The mansion wasn't just a temporary refuge or an elaborate gift. It was a test, a trial period during which she would have the opportunity to prove herself worthy of something much larger and more permanent. Jessica sank into a leather chair that probably cost more than her annual rent, trying to process information that seemed to reshape reality with every sentence. According to the letter, the man and woman from the diner had been engaged in a power struggle over the disposition of a family fortune that included not just this mansion, but a network of properties and investments that spanned multiple states. The man, identified as Marcus Whitmore, was the designated heir, but he had grown tired of the responsibilities and restrictions that came with his inheritance. The woman, his sister Catherine, wanted to maintain family control, but lacked the legal standing to simply take over the estate. Their argument in the diner had been about Marcus's decision to transfer his responsibilities to someone outside the family. Someone who had proven their character through actions rather than bloodline. Someone who understood the value of hard work and genuine service because they had lived it every day. Jessica read the letter 3 times before its implications fully sank in. This wasn't just about managing a property or serving as a caretaker. Marcus Whitmore was offering her the opportunity to inherit his position as the primary beneficiary of a trust fund that would transform her from a struggling waitress into one of the wealthiest individuals in the state. The mansion was just the beginning, a symbol of the life he was prepared to sign over to someone he believed would use it more wisely than he had. The catch, if it could be called that, was a probationary period of 6 months during which Jessica would live in the mansion and demonstrate her to handle the responsibilities that came with such wealth. She would work with financial advisors and property managers, learning to oversee investments and charitable foundations and all the complex machinery that kept a large fortune functioning properly. If she succeeded, the transfer would become permanent. If she failed, everything would revert to a charitable trust that would distribute the assets according to Marcus's predetermined wishes. Jessica set the letter aside and looked around the magnificent room with new eyes. Every object she could see represented not just luxury, but responsibility. The art on the walls would need to be maintained and insured. The grounds outside would require constant attention from skilled professionals. The various business interests mentioned in the letter would need oversight and strategic guidance. She thought about her life up until this moment, about the careful budgeting and constant worry and the persistent fear that one unexpected expense would send her tumbling into financial disaster. Now she was being offered the chance to live in a world where money was a tool rather than a constant source of anxiety, where she could think about making a difference rather than simply making ends meet. The weight of the opportunity was almost crushing in its magnitude. Jessica had always believed that people like her didn't get chances like this, that fairy tale endings were reserved for characters in books rather than waitresses from run-down diners. But the keys in her pocket, and the letter in her hands, and the magnificent room around her all argued against that limiting belief. She walked to the window and looked out over the grounds, which stretched away into darkness, punctuated by carefully placed lights that revealed glimpses of gardens and water features and paths that led to places she couldn't yet imagine. Somewhere in the distance, she could see the lights of the city where she had spent her adult life serving other people's needs, while her own dreams slowly faded into resignation. The choice before her wasn't just about accepting or declining an incredible opportunity, it was about believing that she deserved such an opportunity in the first place. It was about having the courage to step into a life that bore no resemblance to anything she had ever experienced or even dared to hope for. Jessica returned to the letter and read it one final time, paying special attention to the practical details that would govern the next 6 months of her life. She would have access to all the mansion's amenities and a generous monthly allowance for personal expenses. A small staff would continue to maintain the property, but she would be responsible for making decisions about everything from menu planning to landscape design. Most importantly, she would work closely with Marcus's financial advisors to learn about the various investments and charitable commitments that form the foundation of the family fortune. The letter concluded with contact information for the legal team that would handle the formal transfer of responsibilities and an invitation to call Marcus directly if she had questions or concerns about any aspect of the arrangement. It was signed with a flourish that seemed to capture both the weight of the decision and the genuine hope that she would accept the challenge he was offering. Jessica folded the letter carefully and placed it back in its envelope, then picked up the silver-framed photograph that had been sitting beside it on the mantelpiece. The image showed a much younger Marcus Whitmore standing beside a woman who shared his aristocratic features and confident bearing. They were posed in front of what appeared to be this very mansion, both smiling with the kind of effortless joy that seemed to come naturally to people who had never worried about rent money or medical bills. But as Jessica studied the photograph more closely, she noticed something in Marcus's eyes that reminded her of the man she had observed in the diner. Even in this moment of apparent happiness, there was a shadow of something that might have been loneliness, or burden, or the weight of expectations that had been placed on his shoulders before he was old enough to understand their true cost. The realization that Marcus might genuinely need her help as much as she needed his offer added another layer of complexity to an already overwhelming situation. This wasn't just about charity or good fortune. It was about two people from completely different worlds recognizing something in each other that might be the key to solving problems that neither could address alone. Jessica walked through more of the mansion's rooms, each one revealing new aspects of a life she could barely comprehend. A home theatre with leather recliners and a screen that dominated an entire wall. A wine cellar that descended into cool darkness lined with bottles that probably represented more value than most people's houses. A conservatory filled with exotic plants that must have required constant attention from specialists who understood their particular needs. But it was the smaller, more personal spaces that began to paint a picture of the man who had offered her this incredible opportunity. A study lined with books on philosophy and history, with comfortable reading chairs positioned to catch the morning light. A workshop filled with woodworking tools and half-finished projects that suggested hands-on creativity rather than passive consumption. A small kitchen separate from the main one, equipped with the kind of simple appliances that someone might use to cook a solitary meal when the formal dining room felt too empty and echoing. These glimpses of Marcus's actual life made the mansion feel less like a museum and more like a home that had been waiting for the right person to bring it back to life. Jessica could imagine herself in these spaces, reading in the comfortable chairs, or learning to use the sophisticated equipment in the workshop, or preparing simple meals in the cozy kitchen while the main house slept around her. The grandfather clock in the main hall chimed 3 times, reminding Jessica that dawn was still hours away and that she had a decision to make before the sun rose on what could be either the last day of her old life or the first day of something entirely new and unpredictable. She walked back to the main living room, settled in the leather chair again, pulling out her phone to stare at the contact information Marcus had provided. The number seemed ordinary enough, just 10 digits that could connect her to a man who was offering to change her entire existence. Her thumb hovered over the screen, trembling slightly as she considered what words could possibly encompass the magnitude of this moment. The silence of the mansion wrapped around her like a living thing, broken only by the distant tick of clocks and the whisper of air moving through rooms too large for one person to fill. Jessica had grown accustomed to the constant noise of her regular life, the clatter of dishes and hum of conversation and endless soundtrack of other people's needs demanding attention. This profound quiet felt both luxurious and slightly unsettling, as if the house itself were holding its breath waiting for her decision. She thought about her morning shift at the diner, scheduled to begin in just a few hours. Miguel would expect her to show up with her usual punctuality, ready to pour coffee and take orders and pretend that nothing had changed since yesterday. The idea of returning to that familiar routine while carrying the secret of this impossible offer felt surreal, like trying to fit an ocean into a teacup. But what was the alternative? Call in sick and spend the day exploring rooms that might not actually belong to her? Start making plans for a future that existed only in the elegant script of a letter from a stranger? The practical voice in her head catalogued all the ways this situation could be some elaborate hoax or cruel joke, designed to raise her hopes before crushing them with reality. Yet the weight of the keys in her pocket and the solid reality of marble floors beneath her feet argued against such cynicism. The mansion was real, the letter was real, and the opportunity it described seemed to pulse with its own undeniable truth. Jessica had spent enough years serving wealthy customers to recognize the difference between genuine luxury and impressive facades, and everything around her spoke of resources so vast they had transcended the need for pretense. She stood up and walked to another window, this one offering a view of what appeared to be a formal garden laid out in geometric patterns that would be beautiful in daylight. The moonlight revealed only hints of the careful design, but even those glimpses suggested artistry and attention to detail that transformed landscaping into something approaching sculpture. The thought of walking through those gardens in the morning light, of having the right to explore every path and hidden corner, sent a thrill through Jessica that she tried to suppress. Hope was a dangerous emotion for someone in her position, capable of making rational decisions impossible when the stakes were this high. But the hope refused to be contained, growing stronger with each moment she spent in this place that seemed designed to nurture dreams rather than crush them. Her phone buzzed with a text message, startling her in the profound quiet. It was from Miguel asking if she could cover an extra shift tomorrow because one of the other waitresses had called in with the flu. The request represented everything about her current life that had become routine and predictable, a cycle of obligations and expectations that left little room for the unexpected or transformative. Jessica stared at the message for a long moment, then typed back that she might not be available, that something had come up that required her attention. It wasn't a lie exactly, though it failed to capture the true magnitude of what had come up. She hit send before she could reconsider, committing herself to at least one day of exploring this new reality before deciding whether to make it permanent. The response came back quickly, a string of question marks followed by concern for her health and offers to help if she was dealing with some kind of emergency. Miguel's genuine care made Jessica's throat tighten with emotion. He had been a good friend during her years at the diner, one of the few people who seemed to see her as more than just a uniform and a smile. Leaving that world behind would mean losing connections that had sustained her through difficult times. But staying would mean accepting that this moment of possibility was just an illusion, that people like her were destined to remain forever on the outside of the lives they served. Jessica looked around the magnificent room and tried to imagine explaining to Miguel why she had chosen to walk away from everything she knew to this day. The conversation seemed impossible, not because he wouldn't understand, but because she wasn't sure she understood it herself. The grandfather clock chimed 4 times, and Jessica realized she had been sitting in the mansion for over an hour without making any real progress toward a decision. The letter had mentioned a legal team that would need to be contacted, paperwork that would need to be signed, and a dozen other practical steps that would transform this surreal night into binding reality. But all of those steps required her to first choose whether she believed she deserved the life being offered to her. She pulled out Marcus's letter and read it again, this time focusing on the language he had used to describe her character and qualifications. According to his observations, she had demonstrated kindness under pressure, reliability despite challenging circumstances, and a genuine concern for others that went beyond mere professional obligation. These weren't qualities she had consciously cultivated or even recognized in herself, but seeing them reflected in someone else's words made them feel more real and substantial. The letter also mentioned specific incidents he had witnessed during his weeks of observation, moments when Jessica had gone out of her way to help difficult customers or covered extra shifts for co-workers dealing with personal crises. Reading these descriptions was like looking at herself through someone else's eyes and discovering that her small acts of service had been noticed and valued by a person who understood their true worth. Marcus had written that he needed someone who understood money as a tool for creating positive change rather than an end in itself. He wanted a steward rather than an owner, someone who would see the family fortune as a responsibility to be managed wisely rather than a prize to be consumed selfishly. The distinction seemed crucial to understanding why he had chosen her over countless others who might seem more obviously qualified for such a role. Jessica walked through more of the mansion's rooms, trying to imagine herself not as a visitor, but as the person responsible for making decisions about everything she saw. The art collection alone represented choices about preservation and display that would affect how future generations experience these works. The various staff members mentioned in the letter would look to her for guidance and direction, trusting her judgment on matters that could affect their livelihoods and professional satisfaction. The weight of such responsibility felt simultaneously terrifying and exhilarating. Jessica had spent her adult life in jobs where her primary concern was following instructions and meeting other people's expectations. The idea of being the person who set the direction and made the final decisions represented a complete reversal of every role she had ever played. But perhaps that reversal was exactly what Marcus had recognized in her during those weeks of observation. Maybe he had seen someone who understood the value of service precisely because she had provided it so consistently to others. Maybe he believed that someone who had learned to anticipate needs and solve problems on a small scale could apply those same skills to managing resources and responsibilities on a much larger one. The eastern windows of the mansion were beginning to show the faintest hint of dawn, a subtle lightening that reminded Jessica that the outside world continued its regular rotation, despite the extraordinary circumstances she found herself navigating. Soon the city would wake up, people would begin their commutes to jobs and obligations, and the diner would open for another day of serving coffee and eggs to customers who had no idea that one of their regular waitresses was sitting in a mansion trying to decide whether to accept an inheritance that would change everything. The contrast between those two realities felt almost absurd in its extremity. In a few hours she could be back in her uniform, wiping down tables and counting tips, pretending that this night had never happened. Or she could be making phone calls to lawyers and financial advisors, beginning the process of learning to manage wealth beyond anything she had ever imagined possible. Jessica returned to the study she had discovered earlier, drawn by the comfortable reading chairs and the sense of quiet contemplation that seemed to permeate the space. The bookshelves were filled with volumes on philosophy, history, and economics, suggesting that Marcus had spent considerable time thinking about the broader implications of wealth and power in society. Several books were marked with bookmarks or showed other signs of frequent consultation, indicating ongoing engagement with complex ideas rather than mere decoration. She pulled one of the marked books from the shelf and opened it to a highlighted passage about the moral obligations of those who inherit resources they did not create. The margin contained handwritten notes in Marcus's careful script, questions and observations that revealed someone wrestling seriously with the ethical dimensions of his position. The notes suggested genuine struggle with concepts of fairness and responsibility, an internal dialogue about how to use inherited advantages in ways that honoured both the original creators of the wealth and the broader community that had made such accumulation possible. Reading these private thoughts gave Jessica insight into the man who had offered her this opportunity. Marcus wasn't simply looking for someone to take over burdensome responsibilities he no longer wanted to handle. He was searching for a person who would engage thoughtfully with the same ethical questions that had clearly occupied much of his own attention. He wanted a successor who would continue the internal dialogue about purpose and obligation that his notes revealed had been central to his own experience of wealth. The realization that Marcus saw her as capable of such sophisticated thinking was both humbling and empowering. Jessica had never considered herself particularly intellectual or philosophical, but the letter and supporting documents suggested that he had observed qualities in her that went beyond simple kindness or reliability. He seemed to believe that she possessed the moral reasoning and emotional intelligence necessary to navigate complex decisions about resource allocation and social responsibility. The dawn light was growing stronger now, beginning to reveal the true scope of the gardens and grounds that surrounded the mansion. Jessica could see pathways leading to structures she hadn't noticed in the darkness. What appeared to be a greenhouse, a small cottage that might house groundskeeping equipment, and terraced areas that suggested careful attention to both beauty and functionality. The entire property represented a vision of how wealth could create environments that nurtured both human flourishing and natural beauty. She thought about her own small apartment, with its view of a parking lot and air conditioning unit that had been broken for 3 months. The contrast wasn't just about luxury versus necessity, but about the difference between environments that inspired possibility and those that seemed designed to contain and limit. Living in a space like this mansion wouldn't just change her material circumstances, it would alter her entire sense of what was achievable and appropriate to hope for. The phone number Marcus had provided seemed to glow on the letter as morning light filled the study. Jessica realized that she had spent the entire night thinking about this decision, weighing possibilities and consequences, but she hadn't actually spoken to the person whose offer had created this extraordinary situation. The letter provided information and context, but it couldn't answer the dozens of specific questions that had occurred to her during her exploration of the mansion. What exactly would her day-to-day responsibilities involve? How much independence would she have in making decisions about the property and investments? What kind of support system existed to help her learn the skills she would need to manage such complex holdings? The letter had outlined the broad structure of the arrangement, but the practical details would determine whether this opportunity represented genuine empowerment or simply a more comfortable form of servitude. Jessica picked up her phone and stared at Marcus's number, her finger hovering over the call button. The early morning hour made the call seem more intimate and immediate than it would later in the day, when the business world would be awake, and such conversations would feel more routine. But perhaps that intimacy was exactly what this situation required, a direct connection between two people trying to solve problems that couldn't be addressed through normal channels or conventional approaches. She took a deep breath and pressed the button, listening to the phone ring while her heart hammered against her ribs. The stakes felt impossibly high, but Jessica realized that not making the call was itself a choice, one that would leave her forever wondering what might have been. The phone rang 3 times before a familiar voice answered, sounding alert despite the early hour. Jessica, Marcus said, his tone warm with recognition. I was hoping you would call. I've been awake most of the night myself, wondering if I made the right decision in leaving those keys with you. His admission of uncertainty made Jessica's own nervousness feel less isolating. Mr. Whitmore, she began, then paused, unsure of the appropriate level of formality for a conversation that had already shattered every social convention she understood. I'm calling from the mansion. I've been here all night trying to understand what you're offering me. And what conclusions have you reached? Marcus asked, his voice carrying genuine curiosity rather than anxiety about her response. Jessica looked around the study, taking in the books and comfortable chairs and morning light streaming through tall windows. I think I'm beginning to understand that this isn't just about money or property, she said slowly. You're looking for someone who will see this wealth as a responsibility rather than a privilege. Someone who will ask the same questions about purpose and obligation that you've been asking yourself. There was a moment of silence before Marcus responded, and when he did, his voice carried a note of relief that suggested she had understood something crucial. Exactly. I've spent 15 years learning to manage this inheritance, and the most important lesson has been that true stewardship requires constant examination of how resources can serve broader purposes. I need someone who will continue that work with fresh perspective and genuine commitment to making a difference. And so Jessica found herself standing at the threshold of a transformation that began with abandoned keys on a diner table and blossomed into something far greater than either charity or chance. The fluorescent-lit world of double shifts and counted tips hadn't prepared her for managing vast wealth, but it had taught her something more valuable. That true service means seeing beyond yourself to the needs of others. Marcus had recognized in her not just kindness or reliability, but the rare wisdom to understand that extraordinary resources demand extraordinary responsibility. As dawn broke over the mansion grounds, Jessica realized that sometimes the universe doesn't just offer us what we want, but exactly what we're ready to become.